The road bent through acres of beech and oak before the house appeared, stone, symmetrical, impossibly composed against the green. Amara and Rowan had never seen a roof so wide or windows so tall. She checked the time on her borrowed phone again, then tucked it into the pocket of her thrifted coat and pressed the bell. She had taken the job interview on faith and bus fare, trusting that careful hands and a steady heart might count for something in a house built on old money and older expectations. The door opened to a man in a navy sweater who wore his grief like a pressed shirt. "Henry Whittaker," he said with a practiced kindness. "You must be Amara." She nodded, feeling the warmth of the foyer press back the chill of the countryside. Portraits lined the walls, quiet ancestors who had never worried about rent. Henry motioned her through a corridor and spoke as they walked. "My son Elliot is 26. He was a professional dancer, ballet and contemporary. 6 months ago he was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive illness. We've been told to expect weeks, not months." He paused. "He refuses to eat enough. Refuses the light. He says he's saving his energy for nothing." Amara steadied her voice. "I'm here to make nothing feel less alone." Henry studied her for a moment, then nodded as if the answer had been both wrong and right. He led her up the grand staircase, past a skylight where rain clicked softly, and stopped at a door half open to music playing so low it felt like memory. Inside, Elliot Whittaker sat at the window in an oversized sweater, cheekbones too sharp, hair too long. His body had the ghost of a dancer's lines, the instinct to lengthen, to turn, to lift, but it all seemed to be happening behind glass. He glanced over. The music paused. "This is Amara," Henry said, then retreated like a man who could no longer bear rooms. Elliot's eyes took her in, curious, then carefully indifferent. "Another caretaker," he murmured. "What will you do, Miss Amara? Hold my hand while I refuse to hold on?" "Clean your room," she said, surprisingly steady. "Boil the kettle. Annoy you into breakfast. Learn what helps. And not call you my brave boy." A low laugh flickered, then hid. "Points for honesty." Another voice came from the doorway, cut with impatience. "Points won't keep you alive, El." A tall man in a camel coat leaned against the frame, green eyes storm-bright, jaw tight. "Rowan Sinclair," he said to Amara without moving. "Childhood friend. Occasional bad influence. Frequent witness to Whittaker's stupidity." Amara met that storm and refused to sway. "Amara and Rowan," she replied. "Occasional miracle worker. Frequent witness to men who think sarcasm is a plan." Rowan's mouth twitched despite himself. Elliot's gaze slid between them, something like calculation warming the gray. "Well," he said softly, "this should be interesting." By dusk, Amara had made tea strong enough to argue with. Elliot drank half a cup in the resigned way of the defeated, humoring the persistent. She opened curtains. She put an orange on his table and did not ask him to peel it. When she headed to the door, he said, "You'll hate it here." "I've hated other places," she said, gathering the empty cup. "I can do it again." In the hall, Rowan caught up with her. "He is not a project." She paused. "No. He is a person. So am I." For a beat they stood like adversaries on the same bridge, each convinced the other would burn it. Rain braided itself against the windows. Upstairs, a dancer tried not to remember a stage. And still, Amara returned at dawn. Routine became a kind of spell. Amara spoke to Elliot as she changed his sheets, jokes tucked into corners and tuck-ins. She learned how to coax 2 slices of toast and a small bowl of papaya their way past the barricade of his apathy. She learned which records smoothed his forehead, Bill Evans' Olafur Arnold's, an old Fela Kuti track that made his fingers tap in absent choreography against the duvet. Rowan arrived most afternoons and prowled. He asked Elliot to walk the garden. Elliot refused. He asked him to sit in the sunroom. Elliot said the light felt like interrogation. He tried to be kind, failed, and left early, anger snapping at his heels like a dog that had only ever known protecting. On the 5th day, Amara found Elliot on the floor beside his bed, not fallen so much as folded. She sank to her knees. "Permission to sit?" she asked, voice a whisper that refused to pity. He nodded. She sat cross-legged like a child and waited, breath patient as tide. After a while he said, "I almost went back to the studio yesterday. Stood at the door like a tourist looking into his old house. I used to be my body. Now my body is a town that has evicted me." She didn't reach for him, she reached for language. "Cities make new neighborhoods," she said. "They don't ask permission from grief." He huffed a small smile. "Are you always like this? Hungry?" "Yes." She tilted her head. "What did you want to do at the studio?" Stand at the bar. Remember that I once knew how to fly. That evening, Rowan cornered her in the pantry where copper pots hung like medals. You make him talk, Rowan said, accusation wrapped in awe. Then you make him tired. I make him eat, she returned. I make him choose. That is not cruelty. Rowan leaned closer, the air between them suddenly crowded with electricity neither wanted to name. Don't give me pretty speeches, Amara. He is dying. He needs rest, not hope to drag behind him like a broken wing. She lowered her gaze to his tie. Hope is lighter than you think, she murmured. Hatred weighs more. How long do you intend to carry yours? The words landed with the accuracy of a dancer's last perfect turn. Rowan flinched, then studied her as if recalibrating a map. In the late hours, he joined Henry in the library and argued for an intervention. Henry, exhausted by every kind of war, simply shook his head. The next morning, Elliot asked for paper. He wrote slowly, printing as if each letter had to be convinced to exist. When he handed the pages to Amara, she saw a column of small squares with lines beside them, a child's treasure hunt refitted to a grown man's vanishing time. Bucket list, he said. I don't have months. I have weeks, perhaps less. I can't do most things. But I can still choose how the last days look. She read aloud, returned to the studio. Watch the sun tear the sea open. Roadside suya at midnight. A dance under a sky with no roof. A kindness done anonymously. Teach someone to waltz. Forgive something. The last line was a dare to himself. Let them love each other shamelessly. Her eyes skated to him. Elliot raised his chin, daring her to scold. Them? She asked, keeping the room gentle. The two most stubborn people I know, he said, then turned to the window so she wouldn't see the heat rise in his eyes. If I can't be the one to make you happy, I can at least make sure you are. He pressed his knuckles to his mouth. Please help me do this, Amara. Her yes was quiet and absolute, the kind that bears weight without bending. When Rowan arrived, Elliot handed him the list. You're planning field trips now? Rowan scoffed, but the tremor at the corner of his mouth read like relief. Fine. We start with the studio. Amara glanced at them both and knew, with a certainty that nearly knocked her back, that none of them would leave this house unchanged. The studio smelled of rosin and remembered sweat, of bodies that had believed in air. Elliot stood in the doorway while the administrator, white-haired and kind, pressed his hand in both of hers and said his name like a blessing. Sun made long rectangles on the marley floor. The sound of a piano drifted from a class down the hall. I can't, he said, jaw tight. You already are, Amara answered, and together they waited until his muscles stopped bracing for the past. Rowan fetched 3 folding chairs and arranged them by the back wall the way church ushers do when grief and celebration demand the same pew. Elliot watched the class, eyes hungry. At the bar, a girl in a navy leotard fell out of a turn, cheeks flushing. Elliot flinched as if her imbalance had struck his own bones. His hands, of their own accord, minute corrections. Lift here, lengthen there. Teach me, Amara blurted, breaking some vow to stay only within the job description. She pointed to the empty corner. Something small. Elliot looked startled, then alive. Second position, he said, voice softening into a teacher's. Heels under hips. Knees over toes. Imagine you are pouring sand from your pelvis like an hourglass. He turned to Rowan. You too. Rowan raised an eyebrow, half aristocrat, half amused wolf, but stood beside Amara, mirroring her stance. Elliot, sitting now, coaxed them through a porte de bras. Arms from the back, not the wrists. Don't flap, breathe. Yes, Amara. Rowan, stop pretending you don't care. Your body knows how to listen. It turned impossibly into a lesson. Elliot's hands drew invisible lines in air, and they followed. Rowan, despite his resistance, had balance and a surprising control. Amara had openness, a quickness to translate instruction into motion. When Elliot asked them to face each other for a simple waltz pattern, 3 counts, forward and back, Rowan placed his palm at Amara's shoulder blade. The contact was respectful, exact. Her breath snagged. Their eyes met and held. Count, Elliot murmured. Not for the music, for trust. 1 we agree. 2 we move. 3 we stay. They moved. It was not graceful, not at first. But on the 3rd repetition something settled, that click when a lock admits a key. Rowan's hand at Amara's back learned the difference between pushing and guiding. Amara's fingertips on his shoulder learned the difference between resting and relying. The air between them warmed with an honesty that surprised them both. Elliot watched, joy and sorrow braided in his eyes like 2 colors of the same ribbon. After, in the corridor, Rowan leaned against the wall and tipped his head back. I haven't felt that in a long time. Like being trusted? Amara asked. Like being met, he said, and looked at her in a way that made both of them take a careful breath. Elliot stayed behind in the empty studio. Amara, sensing he wanted the silence, let the door close gently. Inside, Elliot rolled to the center, sat on the floor and pressed his forehead to his knees. The room held him the way old beds hold the shape of a body that has loved them. He did not sob. He leaked, quiet, steady, like a roof deciding after years of weather to tell the truth. When they drove back, Elliot slept in the car, lashes dark against a cheek gone too thin. Rowan drove as if speed could build a wall between past and future. At a red light, his hand found the list between the seats. He checked the first box and whispered almost angrily, "Good." Amara folded her hands over her lap and tried not to think about the feeling of his palm at her back, the certainty of it, the way her body had known the word for that sensation without needing translation. The second list item led them to the coast. Watch the sun tear the sea open. They went at dawn, Elliot in a soft gray hat that made his cheekbones look gentler, Amara in a scarf Henry insisted she take, Rowan in a peacoat that could have walked down a runway if it hadn't been too busy learning how to be practical. They stood on the cliff path as a slice of gold appeared at the lip of the world. The wind bullied and blessed. Elliot's face loosened into awe, that old choreography of wonder returning to animate him. I used to think sunrises were clichés, he said. Turns out clichés are just things that stubbornly keep being true. Rowan tucked the scarf more securely around Amara without thinking. She glanced up, the simple intimacy vibrated through her. The color behind them turned everything into something forgivable. When the light became day, they descended into the seaside town. Elliot pointed to a Ferris wheel on the pier. You two, he said. Take a ride for me. Then we take one all together, Amara bargained. Deal, Elliot said, but his eyes said, save your bargains for the battles you can win. The wheel carried Rowan and Amara into a sky that smelled like salt and sugar. In the small car they were suddenly closer than either had planned. The town spread and narrowed beneath them. Rowan's knee touched Amara's. Neither moved. I don't do well in small spaces, he admitted, a confession disguised as small talk. Then look outward, she suggested, and turned his attention to the horizon with the smallest tilt of her hand. He followed her gaze and something in his shoulders dropped 2 inches. Better? She asked. Much, he said, voice altered. You have a talent. For what? For pointing people toward what doesn't hurt. They turned to each other with the uneasy gratitude of soldiers who'd found a quiet field. Rowan reached for her hand but stopped a breath away. She bridged the rest and let their fingers find the shape of mutual courage. The wheel paused at the top. The sea threw light like coins. Later all three went up together. Elliot laughed as wind stole his hat and Rowan chased it like a boy and failed like a gentleman. When they were low enough to see the people waiting on the pier, a child waved up at them, wild with the joy of acknowledging strangers. Elliot waved back and did not hide the tears. After fish and chips eaten from paper they walked the shore. Rowan found a shell, held it out to Amara. It sounds like the inside of a cathedral, he said, and when she lifted it to her ear he leaned in too, their temples touching, that accidental, reverent intimacy that happens when two people agree to listen to the same unknown. On the drive home Elliot dozed again. Rowan's hand rested on the gearshift, relaxed. Amara watched his knuckles, the map of tendons there, the way strength can look like patience if you teach it. He caught her looking. Neither of them looked away quickly enough to pretend. At Hartfield, Elliot insisted on tea in the sunroom. He placed the list on the table and drew a box beside an empty line, writing in a new item. Hear the sea together. He checked it, then underlined together. He did not look at them. He didn't need to. The room held the answer already, humming like a distant choir. The third item was written without romance and arrived dressed in it, a dance under a sky with no roof. Rowan arranged a small outdoor cinema in the garden, blanket-strewn lawn, a projector quietly clearing its throat as dusk dimmed. Henry, determined to honor the list, had string lights threaded through the pergola. Elliot asked that only the 3 of them attend. He wanted the night to belong to the deliberate. They watched an old black-and-white film about stubborn love. Elliot lay on a lounge with a cashmere throw and the look of a man pretending not to measure breaths. Amara and Rowan shared a blanket because the air carried a sly chill. On screen, a kiss was withheld for so long it became a thesis. When it finally arrived, the garden exhaled. Dance? Elliot said, voice a little hoarse as the credits rolled. He pushed himself up and held out his hands. Show me what you learned. Amara stood, heart a bird. Rowan rose and offered his palm. The grass accepted them. The string lights shook a soft gold over their shoulders. There was no music, then suddenly there was. The projector left a track playing low, just enough for the body to find its steps. Rowan's hand settled at Amara's back again with that careful authority she had learned to trust. They began with the studio waltz, 3 counts that meant more than math. Count, Elliot reminded from the lounge, smiling. 1 we agree. 2 we move. 3 we stay. They moved, and the world rearranged itself around their decision. Amara looked up at Rowan and saw, below the polished, defensive wit, an unguarded man who had run out of jokes to protect himself from love. He looked down at her and saw, in the steadiness she wore like a second skin, the exact opposite of the chaos he had been living since the diagnosis. It began to rain. Not a storm, a benediction. String lights turned to halos in each drop. Rowan laughed, startled, and Amara did too, and they did not stop dancing. Elliot watched with a joy so intense it looked like pain. When the song gave itself to silence, Rowan did not step back. Amara did not either. The kiss, when it arrived, was not a conquest. It was a conversation that had waited for the right syntax. It was soft then certain. Elliot looked away, granting them privacy, and wiped his face without apology. After, under the pergola, they sat close, hands laced on top of the blanket like a declaration no list had required but had made possible. Elliot sipped his tea and said, 1 more box checked, and if his voice cracked, the rain volunteered to pretend that was its fault. That night, Amara found Elliot awake and restless. She sat at the edge of his bed. You okay? She asked. He nodded, then shook his head. I wanted to be the person who kept you. That's the truth and the selfishness together. But I want more to be the person who refuses to cage you inside my ending. He took a breath. So when your happiness arrives, promise me you won't apologize to me for it. She swallowed. I promise. He smiled, and it looked like peace rehearsing for the real thing. The next item on the list took them to a beach house Elliot's family rarely used in winter. A low, beautiful structure that faced the Atlantic and pretended the wind was a friend. Make a fire and tell the worst truth you've been hoarding, Elliot had written, half daring, half pastoral. They drove down with blankets and soup in a flask and a resolve to make the day kind. Elliot slept most of the way. In the house, Rowan coaxed a fire into existence with the same focus he had once applied to deals and disasters. Amara cooked noodles on the old stove and whispered a prayer she would never have admitted to speaking. When the fire burned steady, Elliot stirred as if called by an old choreography. He looked at the 2 of them curled together on the rug, a study in comfort he had curated, now alive in front of him. He held out his hand. Truths, he said. Rowan spoke first, voice low. I have been so angry with you for months, El. It was easier to be mean than to be afraid. I hated everyone who couldn't fix it, including you. Especially you. He looked into the fire. It wasn't fair. I'm sorry. Elliot nodded slowly, a pride in his gaze that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with love. Thank you, he said, and meant it. Amara took a breath. I grew up counting coins to ride buses that didn't always arrive. I learned to make myself small in rooms like this so I wouldn't be asked to leave them. Then I met you both and had to learn to be exactly my size. It terrifies me. She put her hand over Rowan's. It thrills me. Elliot smiled. Good. Terror and joy often share a mother. He picked up the list, checked 2 more boxes, make a fire, tell the worst truth, and then sat back, tired and oddly light. It happened fast, as so many important things do. Elliot's face drained of color, his breath hitched, his hand reaching for the blanket missed. Amara was on her knees, Rowan calling emergency services with a voice that had shepherded crises before but never this one. They rode in the back of the ambulance, fingers threaded across the space between their seats, Elliot's name a prayer they said without moving their lips. In the hospital's too bright corridor, Rowan folded over and let himself cry. The sound was not cinematic, it was human. Amara held his shoulders and anchored him without telling him to be strong. When Henry arrived, white with fear, he found the 2 of them guarding Elliot's door like votive candles. Hours later, a doctor spoke the sentences that make time political. He's stable for now. But the arc is unchanged. Elliot woke and saw them and, incredibly, grinned. I always liked making an entrance. When they returned to Hartfield, Alex, the butler who had been with the family for decades, handed Rowan a sealed envelope. Mr. Elliot prepared this, he said quietly. Inside, a letter in Elliot's careful print. Rowan, stop pretending meanness protects anyone. Amara, stop apologizing for taking up space in rooms you earned with your kindness. Together, stop wasting the days. Open the blue box in my wardrobe when I'm gone. It contains instructions you will hate and follow. Rowan pressed the letter to his heart as if the paper could become a rib. That night, alone, Elliot wept into his pillow. He tried to be quiet for the house. He failed deliberately. The sound traveled through floorboards and found Amara in the corridor. She did not knock. She leaned her head against his door and let him know, by the way her breath matched his, that grief too could be choreographed. They completed the remaining items in a rush that refused to feel rushed. They left anonymous envelopes with cash at the community center and watched from the car as a mother exhaled in relief and lifted her child. They cooked suya at midnight on the patio, Elliot wrapped in blankets like a king who had decided wealth was measured in spice. They forgave something without telling each other the details. The house felt lighter after. On a windscrubbed afternoon, they drove to the meadow on the far side of the estate with a kite the color of bruised plums. Last on the list, Elliot said, tapping the words, "Fly anything even if it's only a kite." His hands shook when he tried to hold the spool. Rowan stepped behind him, steadying his wrists. Amara ran with the nylon line and laughed in a way that remembered childhood on purpose. The kite stumbled, then found wind, then rose. They watched it climb, and for a long good minute it was possible to pretend the string ran into Elliot's chest and lifted it. "Look," he said, and his eyes were the eyes of a boy who had once decided to spend his life in rooms with mirrors and music. When the wind dropped, the kite floated down as politely as a bow. Elliot sat in the grass and breathed as if air had just been invented. He took out the list and drew a final square. In the blank beside it he wrote, with a hand steadier than he felt, "Let them love each other shamelessly." He held Amara's and Rowan's hands and pressed them together over his knee. "Please," he said, and the word was the most beautiful choreography he had ever made. "Promise me a life." They promised and meant it. The night before he died, Elliot asked Amara to sit at the foot of his bed and read, anything her choice. She read a poem about a field and a door that opens only when you stop trying to force it. Rowan sat in the armchair and did not doze. At dawn, as rain threaded itself into the hedges and the house breathed in, Elliot slipped away with the quiet inherent to finales that were always written into the first act. His face, in that last stillness, held the gentlest version of himself. He had checked every box. Henry sank to his knees beside the bed. Alex closed the curtains halfway because grief need not be blinded nor exposed. Amara folded Elliot's hand into her own and whispered, "Thank you for insisting on joy," the sentence a benediction and a thesis. Rowan, standing, placed his palm on Elliot's chest one last time, then removed it with the reverence people save for reliquaries and old books. After the hearse left, Alex brought a small blue box to the library and set it between Rowan and Amara. Rowan opened it with the suspicion of a man who knows gifts can be assignments. Inside lay a lavender envelope addressed to both of them and, beneath it, a leather folder. The letter was simple: "There is a wedding to plan. Days from now, not months." The folder contains choices I stole from your conversations when you thought I was sleeping. Lanterns, vanilla cake with guava glaze, the song from the rain. Or what makes you breathe easier. Say what you wanted to say the night under the pergola when you thought the word forever might be impolite. Later, when you're stronger, throw the biggest countryside celebration you can bear. Save a chair for me. Put my portrait there so no one forgets that love multiplies and never divides. Amara cried then, great unashamed tears, and Rowan held her the way promises do, firmly without prison. They married in the walled garden 3 days after the funeral, because grief and love refused to take turns. The staff hung the lanterns Elliot had chosen. Henry walked Amara to a small arbor while Rowan waited with a face that had learned to hold joy without apology. Alex read from Elliot's letter, his voice steady until it wasn't. They exchanged rings chosen for comfort, not spectacle. When the officiant invited a moment for absent friends, a breeze curled around the garden as if to say, "Present, present, I am here." Their kiss was not a triumph over sadness. It was a refusal to let sadness define the arithmetic of their days. After they ate slices of vanilla cake with guava glaze and laughed at how right Elliot had been, again about everything that mattered. Months later, when the heaviest first had been survived, first quiet morning, first joke without guilt, first night without waking to make sure the house was still breathing, they planned the second wedding as he had asked, a celebration that made the countryside talk for weeks. The day bloomed bright and generous. Tents rose like ivory sails on the lawn. Musicians set up beneath the plane trees. Guests arrived bearing stories because stories are how love proves it existed in more than one body. Amara wore a dress that moved like water and insisted on letting light through. Rowan wore a suit that looked like it had been designed to be less interesting than his smile. On the aisle's first row, a chair held a framed portrait of Elliot, laughing, eyes half closed, caught mid-gesture as if explaining an impossible step. Henry stood and welcomed everyone with a voice that had learned a new grammar for survival. "We lost a son," he said, "and found, because of him, a broader family." During the vows, Amara placed her hand on the portrait's frame, then on Rowan's chest, as if completing a circuit Elliot had begun and trusted them to finish. The kiss tasted like the rain from the night under the pergola and like the salt from the day the sea opened. Lanterns rose into the evening, the band slid into the song Elliot had chosen. Friends danced until the grass forgot it was not a ballroom. After the toasts, Henry asked everyone to remain while Alex came forward with the leather folder from the blue box. "Elliot left instructions," he said, opening it carefully. The will had been revised with a generosity that made the room gasp in soft, polite bursts. To Rowan and Amara together, Elliot bequeathed a modest trust to fund any foolish joy, the beach house for winters you decide to forgive, and a cottage at the edge of the estate to be the square on the map where home chooses you back. Rowan, overwhelmed, pressed his forehead to Amara's. "He never did anything halfway," he whispered. "Except leaving," she said. "He left us full." They spent their first week as newlyweds at the beach house, which looked less like grief now and more like a promise kept. They cooked, they argued about how to stack plates, they read aloud to each other until the words melted into the sound of the sea. In the morning they walked the shore and wrote Elliot's name in the wet sand, not as a monument to what was gone but as a way of inviting him to keep doing what he had always done, push them toward the braver version of themselves. A year later, on a day when the wind came in as politely as a guest and the windows reflected nothing but sky, their son was born. In the quiet after the first wild hour, Rowan sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, furious miracle and then at the woman who had chosen him without letting grief pick the terms. "His name?" he asked, already knowing. "Elliot," Amara said, the syllables both prayer and laughter. They placed the portrait on the bedside table. It felt extravagant and exactly right. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was a hush that remembered, Amara would stand in the doorway of the nursery and hum the waltz from the rain. Rowan would come up behind her, wrap his arms around her waist, and they would sway there the way they had under the string lights. 1 we agree, 2 we move, 3 we stay. The portrait, in its quiet way, seemed almost to breathe along with them. People said it was one of the great love stories of the countryside. The woman who arrived with a careful heart, the man who had forgotten how to be kind until he was forced to remember, and the friend who spent his last weeks building a bridge he would never cross himself but insisted others dance upon. It wasn't a story about losing. Not finally. It was about the arithmetic Elliot had taught them. Love does not replace, it multiplies. And in a house that had once refused to breathe, the windows were open now, the curtains lifting with air, and a small boy named for a dancer slept, every breath a check mark no list could ever fully hold.